I am Pocho Salcedo. Greetings to our viewers, content distributors, TV stations in Latin America, and those tuning in from coast to coast across the continental United States and Hawaii. Here in New York, we are ready to decode the stories that shape our world. This is not just the news. This is the DNA of the news. Televised debates have been an important tool in the United States presidential elections. From the point of view of the voters, it is a platform to evaluate the candidates, and from the vantage point of the candidates, an opportunity to generate decisive moments that can boost their candidacy and do another. Today, we have an exceptional guest who will help us understand the history of the presidential debates, recount those memorable moments, and explain the evolution of these events over the last many years. Dr. Claire Jerry, welcome to the DNA of the News.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you.
Dr. Claire Jerry is a curator in the Division of Political History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where she specializes in political rhetoric, the material culture of 20th and 21st century campaigning, and the history of the presidency. She has curatorial responsibility for the exhibit The American Presidency, A Glorious Burden, was team lead for the 2020 digital project #VotingHistory, and is part of the team that collects contemporary presidential campaign material. Her work appears in the Smithsonian Book of Presidential Quotations, Smithsonian American Women, and the series Women Public Speakers in the United States. She holds degrees in rhetoric and public address from the University of Kansas and public history from the University of Illinois Springfield.
And well, let's start at the genesis of the debates as we know them in the United States nearly 170 years ago. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a series of 7 senatorial debates, and we still talk about it. Why are they so memorable, and how were they conducted? What issues did they discuss? And tell us a little bit about that genesis.
I think they're so memorable because of the issues that were discussed. It was just right before the breakout of the American Civil War, so the issues were enslavement, states' rights, the opening of new land in the United States, should those new states be slave states or free states. So the topics were one reason we look back to them, but probably even more because of who the two people were. Abraham Lincoln was not the household name yet that he is today, even today. But he and Stephen Douglas traveled all over the state of Illinois, debating each other for a United States Senate seat. And they were very popular events. I think that we can be grateful today that the pattern that they used isn't followed today. The first speaker would speak for 60 minutes. Then the other candidate would speak for 90 minutes. And then the first candidate would have a 30-minute rebuttal. It tells you something both about speakers in the 19th century and the, shall we say, attention span of the audience. And when you think that today debates, we're lucky if we get 90-second answers, let alone 90-minute answers. So the format is very different, but it really caught the nation's attention. Abraham Lincoln did not win that Senate race. Stephen Douglas did, but it definitely helped catapult Lincoln to the presidency just 2 years later.
What a change, really, the way we do it now. But when did the tradition for presidential debates, as we know them, begin in the United States? Were there debates on radio before we had the 1960 debates?
There had been a couple of internal party debates between Thomas Dewey was in a debate in the Republican Party. There hadn't been a debate between the two candidates from the two major parties until 1960 with the Richard Nixon-John Kennedy debate. And it's a combination, again, of interest in those two candidates as well as technology. By 1960, televisions were in about 90% of American homes, so it was possible to reach a much wider audience than you would have been able to before.
And how were the formats and rules of, let's say, that early debates on the debates that followed at that time?
They had 4 debates, and they specified topic areas for them. So the first debate, which is probably the most famous of the 4, was on domestic policy. It wasn't until the 4th debate that they really concentrated on foreign policy, and that probably affected the perception of the 2 candidates over time. Those debates were treated as news events, and they were held in the studios of the major networks. So the first one was in the CBS studio, and there was no audience to cheer or ask questions. It was just the moderators and the 2 candidates. What's interesting about the fact those 4 debates, one of them, they were not in the same place. Kennedy and Nixon were on different sides of the country and were sort of televised into each other as well as televised into the public audience. So the format was quite a bit different than what we think about today.
Well, thank you. And let's talk about a little bit about the organization of the presidential debates. Who have organized the debates in the past? And more or less, what was the format? I understand the League of Women Voters was involved, and then the Commission on Presidential Debates, but there were many changes, and even now we have a different approach. Tell us a little bit about it, please.
Sure. So that first debate was held in studios, and there were back and forth questions between the candidates. They didn't really address each other. They answered questions from the moderator. Then there were no debates we skipped 16 years until 1976. In part because of the perception that the debates might have given an outsized influence to the lesser-known candidate. So, for example, Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic incumbent, was not interested in giving extra time to Barry Goldwater, the Republican challenger. There was talk, it probably was a little overstated, but a lot of talk in 1960 that Richard Nixon might have lost the election because of the debates. And so he was certainly not interested in debating in 1968 and 1972. But you get to 1976, and we have an incumbent president, Gerald Ford, who succeeded Richard Nixon after the resignation, but wasn't particularly, I think, well-known nationwide. And then the challenger, Jimmy Carter. Both of them were willing to debate. The League of Women Voters became the sponsor at that time. And they were still behind a podium. There were still moderators. There were these very short answers, 2-minute, 3-minute kinds of answers. And the League of Women Voters started holding those debates. They sponsored them in 1976, 1980, and 1984. And they held most of the debates in large public arenas. So maybe a convention center or a performing arts center. And they started to have public audiences for the League of Women Voter debates. The candidates in the League were having some disagreements about how the debates should be run and who should be deciding the format, who should be picking the moderators. So in 1988, a bipartisan committee, the Commission on Presidential Debates, was created after 2 different studies said we probably needed this bipartisan commission. And so when they started hosting the debates in 1988, not all of them, but the vast majority of them were then held on college campuses. And there were public audiences, not exclusively, but often college students were invited to come. Some of them, they started having more what we would think of as a town hall type of meeting where actual citizens or voters got to ask the questions instead of moderators, but still on that college campus environment. But again, there were starting to be some disagreements between the parties and the commission about how things should be run. We get to 2020 with the international pandemic, and people aren't going to be able to come and watch. And so again, it was back to just a very small venue. And now in 2024, we've almost come full circle. The commission is not sponsoring this year's debates. They're back in studios of networks, and we're back to no public audience, nobody asking questions except the moderator. So it's interesting. We've almost come full circle this year.
And with the added, I think, change as well that now the candidates have gone directly to the networks. They have make their own arrangements. Why do you think that happened?
Well, I think that parties and candidates like to retain as much control of it as they can. And of course, Both parties want to do what they perceive as in the best interest of their particular candidate, whether that's format, standing up, sitting down, how long should the answers be, should the candidates speak directly to each other. And then it becomes a negotiation between the two parties, what really matters to one side, what really matters to the other, as opposed to turning all of that control over to a commission or to the league.
Well, how significant are the presidential debates in influencing voter decisions? Are there examples where a debate performance significantly altered the course of election, all the way from Nixon to the present time?
Well, I'll start in the present because it's certainly the most dramatic example. I think there had been a lot of belief that maybe debates didn't really matter and why were we still doing them? And of course, the Democratic Party this year now has a new candidate, largely because of a debate that happened before the conventions, which was unprecedented. We had not had the formal nominating process yet, although both parties knew who their candidate was going to be. So this year seems to demonstrate that debates still have quite a bit of power to influence things. But going back to 1960, again, the research at the time was somewhat mixed about how much influence it had. Many voters said that it influenced them, but if you match up how many voters said that to pollsters and what the actual final voting looked like, it's a little hard to match that up particularly. John F. Kennedy was known to say many times that he didn't think he would have won without the debates. He certainly was not a household name, and it certainly raised his public face with the audience in a way. Richard Nixon was the sitting vice president, so was very well known to people. Both of them were experienced debaters. There's a lot of research that used to say, well, Kennedy won the television audience and Nixon won the radio audience. Contemporary scholars have pretty much disputed that conclusion, that those surveys were often just taken with one party, for example. So probably what happens more, with this year's example being a notable exception, is there's a reinforcement of an attitude that you bring to the debate, that you become even more committed to your candidate, or you find an answer your candidate gave that you particularly like. It's been a little hard, I think, over time to decide that sort of small group in the middle, those undecided voters, how much does the debate affect them? And now in the United States, with so much early voting and voting by mail, there will be, and have been for the last couple of cycles, people who have voted before the debate happened. So clearly their vote was not influenced by the debate. So I think not to have them would raise some questions for the voting public. Why are you not willing to participate in this debate? But how much does it transfer into actual votes? I think that's an open question.
Thank you very much. We'll be back right after this brief pause, and we will be talking, among other things, about some memorable moments through the history of the debates. We'll be right back. And we are back with Dr. Claire Jerry. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome back. We were talking about some special moments that had some significance. And I remember this debate, and I believe it was in 1984. Reagan was 73 years old, and Walter Mondale was 56. And the issue of age, as it is now, was also an issue at that time, but Reagan said something interesting. Tell us a little bit about it.
One of his opening remarks indicated in his very dry wit sort of way,
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
And that, you're right, that clip has been getting a lot of airtime this particular year. And one of the things that's so wonderful to me about that moment is that Walter Mondale burst out laughing as well. And it really diffused any tension, but perhaps unfortunately for Mondale, it also diffused the issue. That Reagan really took humor and put the age question to rest at that moment, and it never really got legs again.
1976, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter are on a debate. And then there is Gerald Ford saying something along the lines that there was no domination over Eastern Europe by that time in the Soviet Union.
This may be one of the examples to the question we talked about before, when do debates make a difference? There's no question that answer hurt Gerald Ford in that debate, because clearly everyone listening would have had the reaction of course, there's Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. And Ford tried to explain that he was saying, we won't tolerate this, or we will make sure it doesn't keep happening. But that's not what came across. And it was a very unfortunate moment in that debate. And they had one other unfortunate moment. In one of their debates, the sound went out for like 27 minutes. And the cameras stayed on them while they stood totally silent, waiting for the sound to come back on. And they both said later they wished they had walked around or talked to each other, because they actually respected each other a great deal. But it was not just a great sort of series of debates all the way around.
Well, thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about, you just brought up the issue of the sound, so let's go through the issues of technology. The introduction of radio changed the way debates were taking place. The introduction of television changed the way radio conducted debates. But now, with technology, the introduction of the internet, fact-checking, and different social media outlets are also changing. How is that happening, and what is the impact from your point of view?
I think that's a great question. And I think the impact really goes across sort of all types of political communication, because very few people, and not as many people as in the past, will sit down and watch something from start to finish. They might come and go. They might wait until the next day and just watch the sound bites or watch a few clips from something. And so depending upon what your favored news outlet is, you might not see a clip of your candidate not giving a great answer or your candidate doing something else. And so it's a much more filtered experience and much less shared experience. And so I think in addition to it being so many different ways that you can encounter the debates or any political speech, you're going to hear different interpretations, you're going to see different fact checkers, you're going to hear different pundits. And so your whole experience of the event will be different. So that the idea, in 1960, we only had 3 networks to begin with, and so everybody was watching the same feed at the same time. That's not true, and it does change the message that you receive, or can change the message you receive.
So as a community, as a nation, we don't have the same experience, perhaps at least during the broadcast.
Right. That's a really great point.
Well, let's talk a little bit. You mentioned that the debates in the past, until recently, pre-COVID, they were in front of live audiences, and normally in the universities and colleges across the country. Are we losing the educational touch? Was that an important ingredient of those debates?
It certainly was for the colleges where the debates were held. Many of them had whole sets of programming. They would have voter registration drives for their students. They would bring in particular experts. And often students were, if it was a town hall, students would be helping to ask the questions. And so I think not only did it affect the colleges where the debates were being held, but then other campuses could point to those students' experience and bring it into their classrooms. So I do think it was very valuable for a variety of reasons to have it on college campuses. And those arenas are often not maybe quite as large as the giant convention centers might be in New York City or Los Angeles. And so you kept that sort of intimate studio feeling, but with an audience. Now, I understand the concern that if you have a public audience, they're going to be cheering and clapping and maybe changing the way of the field, not to mention taking up time. So every year they would try to get people not to do that. And every year, people break the rules. So,
well, thank you very much. Tell us a little bit about your role at the Smithsonian Organization, and also about this really interesting exhibit on presidential debates. What is part of that collection? Just please tell us your view of that and your participation on it?
I'm a curator in the Division of Political History at the National Museum of American History, and we collect politics from both the side of the candidate as well as the side of the citizens or voters who are participating in the campaign. And so we go out and collect signs and buttons and all types of memorabilia. And for the debates, we've been really fortunate. We were able to collect the chairs that Kennedy and Nixon sat in at the first debate. We have the podium that Carter and Ford were standing behind in 1976. But as it moved to college campuses, the objects became really fun because campuses would produce things that said something about them. So one university produced its mascot, which was a horse dressed like Uncle Sam, standing behind a podium like the horse was debating. Another campus that has a glass-blowing major had a very beautiful piece of glass, commemorative glass produced to remember the campaign. And sometimes colleges just produce wild and crazy things. We have a magic 8-ball from Case Western University where you turn it over and you get answers like, I'll get back to you, or let me check on that, things that I suppose you might hear a politician say, because they were promoting their universities as well. And almost every university that hosted a debate said more students applied, more students went to their websites, lots of donors got interested. But the artifacts that they produced really tell us a lot about sort of what used to maybe be a little bit more fun in politics.
Well, thank you very much. What are some of the plans at the Smithsonian Institution as far as political history is concerned?
Well, right now we have two large exhibits on the floor. One is called American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith. And that exhibit shows a lot of the memorabilia, the little novelty items that campaigns use, the buttons, the pipes, the bumper stickers. And that's where the Kennedy and Nixon debate chairs are shown, because we talk about how people brought campaigns into their homes. We also have an exhibit on the American presidency, A Glorious Burden, that talks a little bit about how presidents campaign. A lot of our material doesn't ever get to the floor. Most museums only put about 1% to 3% of their objects on the floor at any time. So our objects often go out on the web, and people can encounter, and your audience can find those at collections.si.edu and look up Kennedy-Nixon debates or the particular election that they want to see what material we have.
Well, and Claire, how do you watch debates and how your habits of watching debates has changed?
Well, I had really wanted to get to a debate in 2020 and, of course, was not able to do so. And now there are no audiences, so I may never get to one in person. I had typically always watched them on television. This year, I did avail myself of an online feed that I thought was going to have like fewer breaks, and I would get just the debate with a little less commentary. When I watch a debate the first time, I want to just take it in and then listen to the commentary later. So that's how I've been doing it this year.
¿Qué nos dice de los
vice
presidential debates presidenciales?
You know, vice presidential debates, some people say, do they really matter? Most of us don't attend a lot to the vice presidential candidate. One very memorable moment was when Dan Quayle, who ran with George H.W. Bush in 1988, wanted to compare himself to John Kennedy. He was young. He was a senator. He'd made this comparison many times. His opponent, Lloyd Benson, who was the Democrat running with Michael Dukakis, knew that he was going to say that or just anticipated. And Lloyd Benson came back as soon as Dan Quayle said, I'm just like John Kennedy. He said, sir, I knew Jack Kennedy. I worked with Jack Kennedy. You, sir, are no Jack Kennedy. And it was great because then that appeared on campaign buttons for the Dukakis-Benson campaign. And, of course, it didn't matter. Bush-Quayle won the election anyway. So I think they help introduce vice presidential candidates. I don't know that they change much in the mind of voters.
Is there anything that we should remember about presidential debates that we have not asked you yet, or that you think it's important to put in perspective?
I think that it's important for people to see, if you're watching a debate, you are a consumer of those words. And I would like people to listen for certain kinds of things. What's the general theme that the candidate's trying to promote? How are they describing their leadership qualifications for this job? Is it based on prior work? Is it based on personality traits? How are they talking about values that the viewers might share with them and might be able to see that this candidate will speak to their values moving forward? And what are the basic, what seems to be the topics that will dominate this administration, as well as listening for those unexpected moments that we've already talked about. But I would like people to listen critically to what is said, not just watch the substance, not just listen to the pundits, but what do these candidates seem to be telling you about why you should vote for them?
Well, thank you very much. And in closing, I'm so curious to hear your thoughts. You're a curator and a very important institution recognized around the world. What wish you knew at the beginning of your participation at the Smithsonian that you know now that would have made your work a lot easier?
That is a really fascinating question. I wish I had known a little bit more about how the effort it takes to bring an object into a federal museum. I had never worked at a federal museum before, and so there's a lot of paperwork and different departments that have to be consulted at my previous institutions. If I collected an artifact, and I did some political collecting at those institutions, I could pretty much have it available to the public within a very short period of time. Here, it's often months, if not longer, before it actually gets before the American people or the international audience. So I wish I'd known a little bit more about the process, but I have really enjoyed having the national scope of politics to be able to collect.
Claire, it's been a real pleasure having you in the show. I hope you return soon. Thank you very much for all your thoughts and for giving us a broader picture of what presidential debates are in the United States.
Well, thank you so much, and I would love to come back again sometime.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this journey to understand what is at the core of the news. Stay curious, stay informed. Until next time, see you in our next edition.